Hello, and welcome to the 88th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Maggie Kimberl.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. This is really great. So for those less familiar with Maggie, she's got a lot of great things. She is the president of the Bourbon Women Association, which should just be cool enough as it is, but we'll keep going. She is also the content editor of American Whiskey Magazine. Again, we should just stop there, but she is a freelance spirits journalist focusing on whiskey culture in the United States, though she considers herself to be geographically blessed to live in the epicenter of the bourbon world, Louisville, Kentucky. When she's not covering the bourbon beat, you can find her browsing through vintage vinyl with her kids or tending to her homegrown tomatoes. And I'll share the contact information later. So Maggie, that's a lot of phenomenal stuff.
And we should also mention probably now that I'm also a Gentile. So
Right.
Get that out of the way.
Right. So it is funny the way that we connected. I mean, we really connected through LinkedIn, and I at some point I'd seen your content, bourbon stuff. And then you had written something like in December 2019, 2020 about Hanukkah and drinking and spirit stuff, right?
So during the pandemic, I started looking into kosher cocktails. So I had actually a former college professor of mine reach out and ask me to speak to his congregation about the Jewish history of Kentucky bourbon. And I was like, I would love to do that. And he was like, hey, can we do like a kosher cocktail demonstration? I was like, ooh, that's maybe out of my wheelhouse. I need to do some research and figure out if I can do that. So I did a whole bunch of research, learned about kosher cocktails, and I have written several articles and done interviews with kosher bartenders, kosher mixologists. We have a fellow down here by the name of the Bourbon Rabbi. I don't know if you've heard of him before.
He's been a guest twice on the show.
Oh, cool. So you know him. He's fantastic.
Yes.
So
and it's a great plug for listeners out there. You haven't caught either the Bourbon Rabbi episode or the other episode involving him, Rabbi Chaim Litvin. Definitely check those out.
Cool dude. And he's got his own bourbon now.
Yeah. What are you drinking this during this recording?
Well, yeah. So I am drinking some Larceny Barrel Proof, which is a Heaven Hill product.
Mm-hmm.
That is a Jewish owned company that was founded by 5 brothers in 1935. And those are the Shapira Brothers right there on the label.
Very cool. I have a bunch of bourbons, and this is definitely not the nicest, but it is also a Heaven Hill, Shapira Brothers. I've got Old Fitz here. Got Old Fitzgerald.
That is, I've got that same gold label Old Fitz right over there on my shelf. Looking right at it every day.
It may not be the nicest, but it's drinkable.
I think it's more than drinkable. I happen to think it's a very nice whiskey.
Awesome.
So,
cheers, L'chaim.
L'chaim.
Jews' historical involvement with, are we focusing on just bourbon? I guess bourbon, rye, really distilling in America?
So you kind of have to back it up and talk about it historically, right?
Great.
So you can talk about the bourbon industry, but it's a lot more interesting if you kind of back it up and look at kind of an overview.
And that's why we have you here.
A lot of times people will ask me, have there ever been any, name, X type of people, Jewish people, women, Irish people, whatever, in the distilling industry? And the answer is almost certainly yes. And the reason why is because whiskey, distilling, fermentation, all that kind of stuff, that was really just a matter of survival up until it became like a quote unquote industry. So throughout history, when you have farming, you have people who are doing things to preserve their crops. And among the things they are doing to preserve their crops is they're making beer, they're making wine, they're making cider. Eventually the still is invented. The still was invented by a Jewish woman. Did you know that?
Not at all.
Maria the Jewess is her name.
Wow.
And she is a very interesting character in distilling history. So this was probably, 1,500 years ago. I mean, it's been quite some time ago. It may be closer to 1,000 years ago. So a very long time ago. So a Jewish woman wrote the first book on, she was the first Jewish woman to write a book about physical science. So she wrote about all kinds of different topics, and inventing the alembic still was one of the things in that book.
Where was it?
It was, somewhere in the
In Europe.
Mesopotamia-ish region, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Really? They're not like Poland or Russia or anything like that?
I would have to, you know what? Let's just Google that.
Cool. Alexandria, Egypt is the answer.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So she's a really really interesting character, and that was between the 1st and 3rd centuries in the Common Era.
That far back?
So, yes. So that was
Really?
when she published her book and invented the alembic still. So that's pretty amazing. So that's a really good reason to kind of back up that history, especially when you're talking about Jewish involvement in distilling history. Because when you go all the way back to the literal invention of the still, it was a Jewish woman. So
exciting.
that's pretty cool to hear. And then, so, throughout history, when settlers would come to the United States, they would go into these regions that were, not developed, and they would bring farming equipment with them, and a still would have been just standard farming equipment. So if anybody would have come here, they would have brought, their farming implements and a still.
Is that for, I guess, surplus grains or other harvested products?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when you harvest your grains and you do everything that you need to do with them, whatever you have left over, you throw them in a pot and you distill them. So there wasn't really a concept of like a mash bill per se, or a recipe that you would follow. It was called common whiskey. So it's, whatever you have left over, throw it in the pot, ferment it, then distill it. And, if you turn it into beer, it lasts a certain amount of time. If you turn it into whiskey, it lasts a lot longer. And it was very useful on the frontier days, especially in Kentucky, because hard currency was difficult to come by. So people would trade whiskey for, if you needed a bucket of nails to build a barn, you would go down to the general store with a couple of jugs of whiskey and trade it for a bucket of nails. So it was a very useful thing to have. It was medicine, helped you treat your water, helped you treat any wounds that you had or anything like that. So the easy answer, I spoke to a congregation in Tennessee one time, and they wanted to know, like, tell us about Jewish history and whiskey in Tennessee. I was like, well, that's a little bit harder, because for a long time, it was really just like 1, maybe 2 distilleries, and there's not a whole lot of other history going on there. But if there were Jewish people there and they were engaged in farming, you absolutely had Jewish distillers.
Wow.
So that's the easy answer there.
So then when did it tip from just for farmers, agricultural purposes, into more of a money-making possibility?
So there are a couple of figures, so probably the person credited with being the first commercial distiller in Kentucky is Evan Williams. And that's a brand now that is owned by Heaven Hill, which is owned by those Shapira brothers. They didn't start that brand, but they named it in honor of him. You have to take into account 1935, some Jewish brothers in Kentucky, they probably knew it was not super safe or a good business move to call their whiskey Old Shapira. So they started to name brands after, figures in history, because that was something that was both going to honor the industry and, maybe not expose them to anti-Semitism that was pretty rampant at that point in history.
So I'm going to guess that is a trend in naming, and right. And also, which would, I think, provoke surprise out of listeners who would, you look at names at bourbons, there's no Cohen, bourbon, or Schwartz. There's no obvious Jewish names yet.
Right.
It sounds like they had to.
There are a lot of obvious Jewish business owners, but you're absolutely right. They are not going around naming their whiskeys in Jewish sounding names, because, unfortunately that's a decision that people had to make, especially, in 1930s America.
Yeah.
So, and you're drinking Old Fitzgerald. That's another Heaven Hill product. That was actually Pappy Van Winkle's brand that they bought when Stitzel-Weller went under. And, Larceny, this was one of the first brands that they ever developed. And it was also kind of a play on the John Fitzgerald narrative. He was supposed to be a government gauger, in charge of collecting taxes, but maybe he was doing some illicit activity there. And so this was actually one of the first mainstream bourbons that was completely developed, every part of it, the packaging, the story, the label, the name, everything, by a team of women. And that was a Heaven Hill project that they did.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far with Maggie Kimberl. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Elizabeth Lambourn on Abraham's luggage. Here we go.
Interestingly, traceable among Middle Eastern Christians who sometimes during the Islamic period faced the same problem of accessing grape wine, which obviously they need for the Mass.
Right, in Egypt.
In Egypt. Mm-hmm. Because in Islamic orthodoxy, wine shouldn't be drunk, although culturally wine consumption continued. There were occasions when caliphs decided to sort of issue an edict banning the consumption of wine and its production, which then put Jewish and Christian communities in a bit of a bind, wondering how they could access ritually necessary foodstuffs.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Elizabeth Lambourn. That's a really interesting conversation. I hope you come back for that one. And now back into this episode featuring Maggie Kimberl.
The first commercial distiller is thought to be Evan Williams. He did a lot of different things. He was a brick maker. He was the wharf master in Louisville. He just had his hands in all kinds of different things because you kind of had to during that time. Yeah.
When?
So this was right around the founding of. So Louisville was founded. I think around 1774. Don't quote me on that. I believe Evan Williams was
got a label.
Bourbon Rabbi Bourbon, 1783. There were commercial distillers and there were farmer distillers, and there were different purposes for distilling. So really, one of the things that kind of snowballed and solidified that was public safety. So some of those folks were making some things that were not necessarily great. They ranged from just bad to dangerous. And so that's where you see the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. But even before that, Henry Craver was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant who came to Kentucky eventually. And he got on a steamship and he said, however much money, this is how much money I have. When the money runs out, I'll get off the steamship and go get a job. And he ended up in Henderson, Kentucky. He took a job sweeping floors in a tavern in exchange for room and board, eventually made enough to buy the tavern, eventually bought a nearby distillery, and that became Kentucky Peerless. And that before Prohibition, that was the second largest distillery in Kentucky.
Really?
His family has since revived it. His grandson and his great-grandson. So we now have Kentucky Peerless Bourbon and Rye. They have just actually gone through the process of getting a kosher certification to honor their grandfather.
Really?
Yep.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, it's really neat. So these are all kind of pre-regulation business folks. Another one is Isaac Wolfe Bernheim. He was the mastermind behind I.W. Harper. Again, This is one where he knew that putting Bernheim on a label was maybe a little bit too German sounding, too Jewish sounding. And so he wanted to have part of his name. So he kept the IW. And then he took the Harper part from a thoroughbred horse trainer. So he read about this famous horse trainer in the newspaper and said, Harper, that's going to be it. I.W. Harper. And so the I.W. Harper brand is still around, and Diageo owns that.
Yeah. I must say, I really enjoy the I.W. Harper 15-year. That's a really different tasting bourbon, but I like it.
I like the non-age stated one a little bit better, but that's just me personally. Everybody has their own preferences. And they've done a good job with reviving that brand.
Yeah. I will say my neighbors that we've had it at whatever, no one else likes it. I do. It's not for everybody.
Well, more for you, right?
Exactly.
So, we talked a little bit about the Shapira Brothers. So the regulation took place. It really solidified bourbon as an industry and distilled spirits as an industry. It said, you can't sell people stuff with tobacco spit and turpentine in it anymore. It has to actually be whiskey. So there's some really gross stuff going on.
Really, for the most part in the 19th century, it really was unregulated and had who knows what in it.
They would put things, so you had your good businessmen who wanted to provide a quality product to people. Of course, certainly Henry Craver and Isaac Wolfe Bernheim would have fallen into that camp. Mm-hmm. But then you had people who said, hey, this bourbon stuff's getting pretty popular. Let's buy some grain neutral spirit, vodka essentially, and we can add some tobacco spit and some prune juice and some rattlesnake heads and make people think that it's aged whiskey. We're going to really fool them that way. And that was a thing that happened. Whenever you have a law, there's always some jerk that is the reason for the law. You think now, like, why would anybody put tobacco spit into whiskey? Well, if they can get away with it, they'll pretty much do anything. That's really the moral of the story here.
Wow.
So, you had the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, and then shortly thereafter, you had the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And those were really some of the first consumer safety laws in the country. And that really kind of solidified, the distilled spirits industry and beverage alcohol as a legitimate industry because they now were regulated. And then shortly thereafter, the noble experiment hits, Prohibition. And, it's interesting because there's a lot of history around why Prohibition happened and how Prohibition happened. And at least a part of that has to do with anti-Semitism again, because there were a lot of tavern keepers who were Jewish, a lot of brand owners who were Jewish. And, there was a lot of anti-Semitism around that. And then there was also, at the same time, European sentiment for beer halls and things like that. And so a lot of it was, really just prejudice. And one of the things that you'll read over and over again is that the KKK was very in favor of Prohibition for a lot of various reasons. So whenever they're on board with it, it's maybe not a great idea. But we all know that didn't work out. It lasted about 11 years. And shortly after Prohibition was repealed, that's when the Shapira Brothers got together and said, hey, people are getting pretty thirsty. Maybe we should do something about that. So it started off with 2 Shapira brothers, and then they brought on another one, and then eventually they brought on all 5 of the Shapira brothers. And that is where Heaven Hill came from, and it is still owned by that same family today. So you have that's why they released this 5 Brothers brand recently. This one was just about 6 months ago.
So this is all recent, the 5 Brothers brand?
The 5 Brothers is about 6 months old, yeah. Wow. But they have brands like Heaven Hill, the old Fitzgerald, they have Larceny, they have a lot, Evan Williams, a lot of different, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, Elijah Craig, all of those. So they have a lot of brands, and a lot of their brand names honor the history of Kentucky distilling. And so a lot of these stories would have been lost if they didn't come along and kind of rescue them. So they're a really unique part of Jewish bourbon history, but bourbon history in general. So that after that, in the more modern era, there's still a lot of brands that are owned by Jewish people, partially owned by Jewish people. So post-Prohibition, also Jim Beam wanted to go back and start up the family distillery, didn't have any money. A Jewish man out of Chicago, his name was, what was his name? Blum.
Really?
Put up the money and owned, and he actually ended up owning that brand, or partially owning that brand until the 80s. Wow. So that was, a really big brand that is globally known, very successful. That would not have been possible without a Jewish business investor. They also have a lot of kosher certified products as well.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
Buffalo Trace is partially owned by a Jewish family, and they have also just gone through the process of getting kosher certifications, not on all their products, but on some of them.
I think it's like 3.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a whole lot, but I think that the idea is to do more in the future. Michter's is also partially Jewish owned. That's another one where the partial owner who is observant will actually, temporarily relinquish control of the company for Passover and that sort of thing. And they're in they were, the last time I talked to them, in the process of getting a kosher certification.
Very neat.
I didn't follow up with them to find out where they are with that, but that's something that is in the works as well.
Oh, cool.
So, and then, historically, you have figures like Philip Rosenthal, who owned Schenley. There were basically 4 big spirits conglomerates in the United States from post-Prohibition to about 1975, 1980, and Schenley was one of them. And Philip Rosenthal was the owner of that. Sam Bronfman owned Seagram's. At one point, Seagram's had 11 plants in North America, 11 or 12 plants in North America, among them MGP and Four Roses, both in Lawrenceburg, different states. Same city name.
It's good.
So, and then even down in Tennessee, George Dickel's business partner and brother-in-law was Victor Emanuel Schwab. So lots of Jewish folks in the history of major brands, historically and today.
Can I throw in another one?
Yeah, tell me.
So I actually, because I'm in Cincinnati, and someone asked me about Fleischmann's because they did yeast. Like that's what, it's and that's right here in Cincinnati. So I was looking around and I found this article on a website you might have heard of called bourbonveach.com.
Yep. That's what I was going to say. Yep.
So
I remember reading that.
There's a whole post on Fleischmann's Distilling Corporation.
Yep.
And so I got very excited because that's Cincinnati and it's a Jewish family. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting to see there are some smaller brands that are popping up, that have Jewish roots, not practicing. We've got Koval in Chicago. So Koval is a Yiddish word that means black sheep. So apparently this was something that somebody's Jewish grandmother used to call them, and they named their brand after that.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting one that just came out. So this is a tribute to Sam Bronfman. That was just Mr. Sam. That was just released by Buffalo Trace or Sazerac.
You mentioned earlier there was something, the Five Brothers that Shapira released, that Heaven Hell.
That was in summer of 2021 that they released that.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
And that's one of the ones that you can get if you visit. I don't know if you've had a chance to visit the Heaven Hill Bourbon Heritage Center in Bardstown. They just reopened with a brand new, phenomenal visitors experience with a whole museum. And there's lots of stuff in there about the family history and the family that ran it. So I cannot recommend that one highly enough.
Really? All right. Putting it on my list.
Okay, good.
How far? Actually, let me ask you this: how far is Bardstown from Louisville?
It's about. So I am in the extreme east end of Louisville, so it's about an hour for me. But from downtown Louisville, it's about 45 minutes.
Oh, it's not so bad. Okay.
So for you, depending on where you are in Cincinnati, I was going to say about 2.5 hours.
Yeah. So I was trying to calculate, like, how far is it to Bardstown from Louisville?
Well, and if you do go down there, you can also stop by Bernheim Forest, which is Isaac Wolfe Bernheim's former homestead that he left to the state of Kentucky to be a private forest.
Really?
It's the largest private forest in the Southeast. And I like to go and hike around, and I call it the forest that bourbon built. So there are some really fantastic trails. My favorite is the Canopy Tree Walk. There's also the Isaac's Cafe, which makes use of the fresh produce that is grown in the garden right across from the visitor center. Unfortunately, I don't think they have anything kosher for any observant listeners there, but it's a really cool place to go visit.
So you mentioned a private forest? So
yeah.
Do you have to pay to get into?
So, if you go in during the week, they don't charge you anything to get in. If you go in on the weekend, it's like $5 a car or something like that. If you take a bus, it's like maybe $10 or something like that. So it's not terribly expensive to get in. They're not charging like $50 a head or anything like that. They have a lot of other sources of revenue. And really, it was just something, Isaac Wolfe Bernheim didn't want his kids to parcel it up and kind of destroy the nature that he enjoyed so much. Wow. And so he left it to a foundation. And so his great grandson is actually on the board of directors now. And so I've gotten to meet him and get to know him and hear a little bit of his family history. And, it's been really fascinating.
That's really neat. So I'm still blown away by the I.W. Harper, the Jewish guy Bernheim. So, but I also know that there's a whiskey called Bernheim. How did that? So ultimately, the family name did get appended to a label,
right? And so that's a Heaven Hill brand. They had, I think, at one point bought the Bernheim distillery. So Heaven Hill actually distills in Louisville, and then their warehouses are in Bardstown. So the distillery where they are doing the bulk of their distilling is called the Bernheim 2. So there was Bernheim 1, and then they built Bernheim 2, and I don't know if they owned it before or after Bernheim 2 was built, but at some point they purchased that name and that distillery. And so Bernheim is a wheat whiskey. So, bourbon has to be a minimum of 51% corn. Rye has to be a minimum of 51% rye. This is something that is made from a minimum of 51% wheat. So it's a very different flavor profile, but they did that to honor Isaac Wolfe Bernheim's legacy.
Oh, very neat. It's funny because it just comes across to me as Germanic, not necessarily like Jewish.
And who knows what the thought process was in that. So that would have been 1880s, 1890s. There was also a lot of anti-German sentiment at that point in time. So it wasn't just it was basically like, hey, you sound funny, we don't like you. So unfortunately, but they made some really savvy business decisions. All these folks throughout history, and that's why we're talking about them today.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
In the course of your research into this, especially coming from sort of an outsider's perspective, what have you found out? Any other, interesting, curious tidbits, facts, or otherwise about, the Jewish history of distilling in America?
Well, I think that everything that I learn, I think is really interesting to me. Otherwise, I would, nobody has to twist my arm to do this job, right? This is this is pretty much a dream job, and the fact that I get to just go, oh, hey, I want to go learn about this, and then I go learn about it, and I write a story about it. That's a pretty great way to live. So really, it starts with something piques my curiosity, and then I go down a rabbit hole. So really, when I started learning about kosher dietary laws, that was the thing that was like, for Gentiles, that is very weighty stuff. So somebody had given me a book about, it was whiskey, wine, and halacha. And I read through this whole thing, and there was so much of, it made my brain sweat, right? It was very, very dense.
I haven't, by the way, full disclosure, I haven't read it yet. I've heard about it. I just haven't, I clearly need to read it.
Well, I read it like 4 years ago, so you need to get on the ball, Rabbi Drew.
Yep, definitely.
But it was very interesting to me, because coming from a hospitality standpoint, I feel like, you should be able to say, I understand your needs and I can or cannot accommodate them. And something like kosher dietary laws or something where people, the Gentile understanding of this ranges from sprinkle a little kosher salt on it and it'll be fine to I have no idea what any of this is, and that's like, I was bumping up against this, like, this is hard. How do I get past this? And so that was really the most interesting thing to me, was kind of getting a peek at, an understanding. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in any sense of the imagination, but I feel very confident now if somebody says, hey, I keep kosher. Do you have anything kosher that I can drink? I can say, I have these whiskey options, or I can make you an old fashioned. I can make a kosher old fashioned all day long. So, and that, that's the limitation, but at least I can say, I think I understand. This is what I can do. Are you comfortable with that? And that's really, where it all started. But there are definitely still brands that are being started by Jewish folks out there. And, whether or not they are forthcoming about the fact that they're Jewish, or that's like a major like leading fact about them or whatever, usually eventually I will hear about them and kind of add that into my research.
One thing I'm going to throw in is that's really fascinating to me, and thinking about distillation of whiskeys and certainly Jewish involvement thereof, is when I think of, we have two major centers of distilling in the world. We have Scotland and Kentucky. In Scotland, I'm sure there are some Jews nowadays involved with that, but I don't know that historically in the last, let's say, half millennium, that there have been so many Jews involved. Whereas with bourbon and what's going on in Kentucky and throughout America, Jewish involvement has been much more noticeable.
Yeah, Kentucky is like, America's the melting pot, right? Yeah. And so the Kentucky bourbon industry is no exception. There's a lot of folks who think, it was all Irish and Scottish settlers, and it was not. It was Germans and Welsh people, French, people from really all over the place who came here and found that they were able to engage in agriculture and eventually, start businesses. And so, we have a lot of Jewish involvement in the Kentucky bourbon industry because there was a lot of involvement from all types of immigrants throughout history.
That's really neat. Yeah, it is definitely a different context. Sure. Scotland versus Kentucky. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, I don't know a whole lot about Scotch. I see you're a Scotch guy. You got a tower of Scotch behind you.
Yeah. Bourbon was my gateway Scotch, gateway whiskey. And then that got me ultimately into Scotch, but yes.
Okay. That's fair. I do need to learn a little bit more about Scotch history. I think that's an area where I'm lacking. But today you also have distilleries in Israel. So yes. I actually spoke to a woman who was a distiller in Israel not too long ago. She was here for the ADI conference.
Really?
And so there are now 2 whiskey distilleries in Israel.
What is that ADI?
American Distilling Institute.
Huh.
Yeah, so they had a conference. It's an industry conference, and I gave 3 talks, and I was the keynote speaker for the Women's Summit, and that's where I met her.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's really neat. Wow, this is really fascinating, Maggie. Thank you so much for everything you've shared and for joining us on the show today. So thank you, Maggie.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So before we go, is there anything, Maggie, that you would like to promote?
Always check out American Whiskey Magazine, check out bourbonwomen.org. I'm doing a really cool series on there called Meet the Makers, where I'm featuring different women from the whiskey industry globally. And, if anybody wants to talk to me or have me talk to your group about Jewish whiskey history, I am always happy to talk to anybody about that.
The women piece does make me think about a question I had asked you like forever ago, about Jewish women involved in Kentucky distilling history.
And right? that's one of the questions where we don't have any record of that per se, but we know that it happened, right? Because at one point in time, whiskey making was just a matter of home and hearth. It was like cooking dinner, or canning preserves, or whatever, women would have been doing on those frontier days. So if there were Jewish women here and they were engaged in farming or agriculture in any capacity, yes, they were probably distilling as well.
All right, there we go. So we got some Jewish women history and distilling in America.
There you go.
That's great. Yeah, it is really fascinating because I know you had mentioned you've spoken to some Jewish groups, synagogues. So you're available, whether for certainly Zooming. You've done some
Absolutely.
Zoom.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That's probably the best way to get me. So happy to talk to anybody.
Okay, awesome. All right. And I'll include Maggie's contact information, although a quick and easy way to remember her contact is LouGirl502, which is LOU Girl502 on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then also LouGirl502.com. So
yep, that's the best way to find me.
All righty. Well, Maggie, thank you so much. And L'chaim.
L'chaim. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.